أن تكونوا معنا أو أنتم أعداؤنا. نظرية جورج بوش الإبن هذه استهدفت دولا وأنظمة وحتى أشخاصا. الأستاذ فلينت لافرت خبير الشرق الأوسط لدى طاقم مجلس الأمن القومي في عهد بوش الإبن نال نصيبه من هذه النظرية. سياسة كم الأفواه والتهميش في الإدارات الأمريكية من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. التهميش والإقصاء تارة، والملاحقة والعقاب تارة أخرى، هذا ديدن الإدارات الأمريكية تجاه من يخالفها الرأي حتى موظفيها ومواطنيها، وهو المصير نفسه الذي لقيه البروفيسور فلينت لافرت أستاذ الشؤون الدولية في جامعة بنسلفانيا والخبير في مكافحة الإرهاب في فريق تخطيط السياسات الذراع الاستراتيجية في وزارة الخارجية الأمريكية. لافرت كان لمدة 8 سنوات قبل ذلك كبير المحللين لدى وكالة الاستخبارات المركزية CIA، وبعدئذ تبوأ مركز مدير شؤون الشرق الأوسط في إدارة مجلس الأمن القومي الأمريكي خلال ولاية الرئيس الأمريكي الأسبق جورج بوش الإبن. وكان أيضاً مدير مشروع إيران داخل نيو أمريكان فاونديشن، حيث تمحورت خبراته حول منطقة الشرق الأوسط وسياسة الخليج وشؤون الطاقة الدولية والأمن العالمي. وكمسؤول سابق في الأمن القومي تمتع بغطاء أمني، ينبغي على لافرت أن يحصل على موافقة مسبقة من وكالة الاستخبارات المركزية CIA لنشر أي مقال كتدبير احترازي لمنع تسريب معلومات مصنفة سرية. في 16 من كانون الأول ديسمبر عام 2006 منع لافرت من نشر مقالة رأي كتبها بالتعاون مع زوجته هيلاري مان التي شغلت منصب مديرة شؤون إيران وأفغانستان والخليج في مجلس الأمن القومي الأمريكي في عهد الرئيس جورج بوش، حيث انتقدا فيها رفض إدارة بوش إجراء مفاوضات شاملة مع الحكومة في إيران. دكتور لافرت، كيف يقيم سياسة أمريكا تجاه إيران والمنطقة؟ وهل باتت أمريكا في وضعية سقوط حر ما يجعل أي تدخل عسكري لها في المنطقة كارثياً؟ Flint Leverett, former CIA analyst and National Security Council Middle East staffer expert, one of the most vocal critics of the U.S. foreign policy, particularly towards Tehran, and all this political, all these misconceptions shaping the political and media discourse in the West. Welcome to the Inside, sir.
Thank you very much.
To start, why are you so marginalized nowadays, though you assumed a lot of important posts at various U.S. administrations?
I think it's because over the last few years, especially in the work that I've been doing on Iran with my wife and other former U.S. official, the work we've been doing on Iran especially, it really presents a very fundamental, some might even say radical, critique of American policy, not just toward the Islamic Republic of Iran, but in the Middle East as a whole. In the United States today, if you want to argue that it wouldn't be smart for the United States to go to war with Iran, there'll be people who will disagree with you, but that's an argument you can make and still be in the mainstream. But if you say, but it's also ultimately foolish to sanction the Islamic Republic, and ultimately the United States is going to have to accept the Islamic Republic's legitimacy and come to terms with it on that basis and give up the fantasy of regime change in Iran, then you're making a much more fundamental criticism of the policy, and there are more and more places that will try and marginalize you in the debate. If you go even further than that and say that U.S. policy toward Iran.
Which you
US,
actually did.
U.S. policy toward Iraq, U.S. policy in other parts of the region, that fundamentally what's driving American policy is a post-Cold War determination to consolidate real hegemony in the Middle East. And that this is not only failing, it's not working, but it's actually making America weaker. That is a really radical critique, and a lot of the establishment will turn against you for that.
But the other hawks and even the doves in the various U.S. administrations, they can't see the picture the way you see it.
They can't see it. In part, many of them can't see it because they, in the end, they don't know very much about the Middle East. But even for some who do know something about the Middle East, it's very hard for them to see it because they look at the region through a prism that's shaped by this idea of American hegemony. America is supposed to be the dominant power in the world. And today, that means you have to be the dominant power in the Middle East. And in some ways, from this perspective, America is entitled to try and shape political outcomes in this part of the world, to produce regimes that will subordinate their foreign policies to the United States. And we tell ourselves that the governments that will do this will actually be better for the people of the region. But the real driver for this is a sense that's very widely shared on both the Republican and the Democratic side of the American political spectrum, but a very deeply held sense that America is supposed to, needs to, and is entitled to dominate this part of the world.
Right. You were, you know, by certain parts of the George W. Bush administration, there were various efforts to censor your criticism of the U.S. foreign policy. Why?
That's right. One episode in particular in 2006, it was right after the Republicans lost the midterm congressional elections. The Iraq Study Group report had just come out in the United States, and there was the beginnings of some bipartisan criticisms of the way the Bush administration had handled the Iraq War. And as part of its recommendations, the Iraq Study Group said in a very lukewarm way, but it still said the United States needed to begin engaging Iran. Okay. And so one of the arguments that my wife and I had been making after we left government was that the Bush administration had actually had opportunities to engage Iran, that the Islamic Republic had helped the United States in some very important ways after 9/11 in dealing with the Taliban in Afghanistan and dealing with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and that their reward for this had been the axis of evil speech. And that even after that, though, the Islamic Republic continued to try to find ways to cooperate with the United States to improve relations with the United States, but that the Bush administration had rebuffed all of this. And so in 2006, my wife and I were going to publish an op-ed.
In December, on December
2006,
16th. Yeah,
that's right.
2006.
We were going to publish an op-ed in the New York Times making this argument. And because I was a former government employee, I had to submit my
You were granted
draft.
a security clearance.
That's right. And so as part of that, if I write about things that I worked on when I was in government, I
have
was
to have
supposed
permission.
I was supposed to submit the draft. And I had done this. I'd written a whole book. I'd written many shorter pieces, and I had submitted everything, to the CIA to review and make sure that I wasn't revealing classified information. I wasn't. The agency never changed a word of anything that I wrote. But in this December 2006 op-ed, the White House intervened and said that because my wife and I had both worked at the White House should have the right to weigh in on whether this op-ed contained classified information, and they said that there were several paragraphs in it that did. This was an absolutely manufactured.
But you were denied permission to publish it.
To publish it with those passages. And it was absurd. The passages referred to things which were already in the public domain, that Secretary of State Colin Powell had talked about, that I had written about in things that had been cleared already. And so what we did with the New York Times is we published the op-ed with the blacked out parts that the White House insisted on, but published it with a precede that said, if you want to know what's in these blacked out passages, go to these things that I've already written, go to this speech by Secretary Powell, go to this congressional testimony by so-and-so. Everything that is in the blacked out parts, it's already in the public domain, and here it is.
Here my question, Mr. Leverett, is why did you develop this kind of interest in Iran in particular?
I think a couple of reasons. One was, while my wife and I were both at the White House.
Even your wife?
Yes.
Both of you, your field of expertise is Iran.
It's become that. She was one of the few U.S. diplomats who, first at the United Nations, she was assigned as a diplomat to the United Nations before 9/11. And she was one of the few U.S. diplomats authorized to negotiate with Iran about Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda even before 9/11 in the so-called 6+2 framework. And after 9/11, that became a very important channel for coordinating with Iran, with other countries, about what the United States was going to do in Afghanistan after 9/11. And so after she came to the White House at the end of 2001, she continued to be a regular participant in this dialogue with Iran. And she found her Iranian interlocutors to be very knowledgeable, very constructive, very strategic, and it really began to make us think that, you know, this was a country that the United States could do serious strategic business with. Now, it also became clear to us that in order to do that, the Islamic Republic wanted to be treated with respect, with at least a certain level of acceptance by the United States, be recognized as a legitimate order representing legitimate national interests. But we both became convinced that if the United States would try to deal with Iran on that basis, we could have much, much better relations with the Islamic Republic. After we left government, we were able to begin meeting with a much wider range of Iranian officials, former officials, academics.
You were subjected to a very big storm because of your stances and because of your of the whole issue of your inclination to study Iran and to deal with Iran and whatever recommendations you've given together with your wife.
Yes. As I said, you can make an argument that perhaps in terms of pursuing its own interests, the United States needs to, we would say, hold its nose and deal with Iran. But you can't really make an argument in the mainstream that the Islamic Republic of Iran, this product of the Iranian Revolution, is a legitimate order and that the United States needs to deal with it in that way. That's where we really put ourselves at odds with the mainstream. And I think that was something we had to learn, that we felt very early on that the Islamic Republic had a very rational approach to its foreign policy, to its national security strategy, and that it was certainly possible for the United States to engage Iran on a wide range of issues. What we came to appreciate over time was that part of the reason the Islamic Republic can have as effective a strategy as it has is because this idea of trying to integrate Islamic government and Islamic principles with participatory politics, that this model, and the Iranians themselves will be the first to tell you that they don't have this model down perfectly, that it's a work in progress, but that this idea is something that I think speaks not just to a lot of people in Iran, it speaks, I think, to a lot of Muslims across the Middle East, that this is how people can reclaim their independence, reclaim their political destinies, and shape a political order that's not borrowed from somebody outside or imposed by somebody from outside, that it actually comes out of their culture, their religion, their way of looking at the world. And that's something that's very, very hard for Americans to accept. It's been very hard for them to accept in terms of dealing with the Islamic Republic.
Because maybe of certain misconceptions that we would be talking about, but we have to stop now, Dr. Flint, for a short break, and then when we come back, we will highlight these misconceptions by the West vis-a-vis Iran and many issues in the Islamic Republic of Iran. A short break and we'll be back. Stay tuned.
كبير المحللين الأسبق في وكالة الاستخبارات المركزية CIA وأحد أبرز منتقدي السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية تجاه إيران البروفيسور فلينت ليفرت كيف يصف أبرز المفاهيم الخاطئة لدى الغرب عن إيران لا سيما المجتمع الإيراني، وهل سياسة أوباما حيال إيران أسوأ وأكثر استفزازا من سياسة بوش وكيف ذلك؟
I think there are at least a couple. The Islamic Republic can't think about its foreign policy in what we would say is a rational way in terms of material national interests, that it's so wrapped up with a particular version of Islam, a particular ideology, that it can't deal rationally with foreign policy. I think the historical record just destroys that idea. I think the Islamic Republic has been a very rational and effective actor in its foreign policy, but I think the idea of crazy mullahs is still very, very prevalent in the United States, unfortunately. The other one, it gets to your point about society.
Why was it branded as irrational?
Because Americans culturally have a hard time accepting the idea of a political order that wants to reclaim sovereignty for a country that's been subject to Western penetration for a long time, and that may not be, it's not anti-American, but it's saying we're going to have our own foreign policy, we're going to make our own decisions. We'd like to deal with the United States in a constructive way, but it's not going to be like Egypt under Sadat, say. It's not going to be like Iran under the Shah. We're going to have our own foreign policy based on what we think Iranian interests are, and we'll deal with the United States as constructively as we can on that basis. Americans with a hegemonic point of view about the Middle East
and their
can't
unilateral
accept that.
policy, yes.
It's as bad as, you know, if you look at American policy toward China, for the first 20 years after the Chinese Revolution, we could not deal with the People's Republic of China as an independent actor. We wanted to destroy the People's Republic of China. We almost destroyed our position in Asia. We would not have been involved in the disaster of the Vietnam War if we didn't have this stupid position towards the People's Republic of China. It took 20 years for Americans finally to figure out we're not going to destroy the People's Republic. We're going to need to come to terms with it as an independent actor in Asia. It's more than 30 years after Iran's revolution, and we still haven't,
Americans
haven't reached that point yet with the Islamic Republic. The other really big misconception is that the Islamic Republic is an illegitimate system that is so despised by Iranians that it is always in imminent danger of collapse. We've been telling ourselves for more than 30 years that the Islamic Republic is always on the verge of collapse. And of course, it's never true, but we continue to tell ourselves this. And so it's even people in America who like much of our argument about Iranian foreign policy being rational, and who think that some of our ideas about how American foreign policy should change toward Iran, even some people who will like and be interested in those arguments, they'll get very mad at us for the things we write about Iran's internal workings, because we say, you know, our reading is that for most Iranians who live inside their country, this is a very legitimate system. It's a legitimate system that has produced enormous progress, enormous development in Iran since the revolution. If we just talk about the statistics on literacy for women, educational opportunities for women, how much they've improved since the revolution, I mean, it's a really impressive achievement for the Islamic Republic. But if you say that in the United States, even if you're just reading statistics, reading data, many people will think
they don't buy it, or they don't want to buy it.
They don't want to buy it.
Now, you say in one of your interviews that Obama's Iran policy is in some ways worse than Bush's, and you see that his policies are so much provocative. In what ways and in what sense is it as such?
We think in some ways Obama has been worse than Bush in that Bush never tried to engage the Islamic Republic. He never even really pretended to try to engage the Islamic Republic. Obama talked about engagement. He talked about engagement while he was running for president. He used it in the Democratic primary process to distinguish himself from Hillary Clinton, that Barack Obama had opposed the Iraq War, in contrast to Hillary Clinton, and he would be willing to engage
with Iran,
countries like Iran. But once he was elected, once he took office, you know, it became very quickly apparent that he had no interest in really serious engagement with Iran, that in fact, what the real plan was almost from the beginning was you go through the motions of engagement. You look like you're engaging so that when, you know, you make offers that can't possibly be of interest to Iran, and then when Iran says we can't take these offers, the United States can say, see, we tried to engage, they said no, they're the problem, now we have to go with more sanctions and maybe even down the road military force.
But you know, Dr. Leverett, maybe this is something not everyone knows about, but you know, there has been a kind of, I don't know how we can describe it, whether it's an engagement or something else, but there was a kind of coordination between the US and the Islamic Republic of Iran when it came to different dossiers, like in Bosnia, like in Afghanistan,
That's right.
Even in Iraq, you know, with the formation, who's going to be the prime minister or whatever. So there was such kind of coordination. Where do you put this?
I put that, I think that there were, from the late 80s until, you know, just a few years ago, there were several episodes getting U.S. hostages out of Lebanon, getting weapons to Bosnian Muslims when U.S. law prohibited the Clinton administration from doing it, the kind of cooperation on Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda that I talked about earlier. And in all of these episodes, Iran cooperated with the United States, did much of what the United States asked it to do, partly because its interests overlapped with those of the United States in those situations, but also because Iranian policymakers calculated if we're seen by the United States as cooperative in this area, maybe it will prompt U.S. policymakers to rethink their hostility toward the Islamic Republic. And in every one of these cases, as we go through in our book, the United States simply took the cooperation from Iran and then would not go any further, would not go into any kind of strategic dialogue with Iran, and in fact usually cut off the tactical cooperation with Iran and, you know, put more sanctions on Iran or did something else to make relations worse. And so I think from an Iranian perspective, you know, I would be surprised if Iran would try that kind of issue-specific cooperation again. They tried it multiple times over about a 20-year period, and it simply did not work. The United States is not prepared to improve relations with Iran on that basis. And so now I think the Iranian view is, if the United States wants to accept the Islamic Republic and to accept that it represents legitimate national interests, deal with us on that basis, that's one thing. But they're not going to be, you know, providing help in particular areas to the United States just to have the United States take that and in some ways punish Iran.
Right. Former CIA analyst and National Security Council Middle East staffer expert, Dr. Flint Leverett, thanks a million for joining us on this interview.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net. إذا theinside@almayadeen.net. من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم.